This video is going to be kind of biographical because I have found a short clip coming from the 60s when I was a kid that really articulates the intentions of the left, of the the Marxists and the Bolsheviks, to change the way we in this country have lived for a couple hundred years. And that intention was brought home to me when I was very, very young, because I grew up in a family that had bought into the idea that Marxism was going to fix what was wrong with humanity. And in the 1950s, I had an uncle, Marty Ritt, who was a Hollywood director, and he was blackballed. And I had an uncle who was the general secretary of the Communist Party USA, Eugene Dennis, and he and his wife worked for the Communist Party, and they were some of the angriest people I ever met. They had an agenda. And so as a youngster, I went to school. I was a watcher. I was a slow kid. I didn't get involved in the normal things because of whatever. And I noticed a lot of things as a child that most kids don't bother with, I guess. I noticed how the people who wanted revolution in the family I was part of were so passionate about it. And the people that the school kids and the parents that I knew were not paying attention to what was happening very well. We had TV starting in 1951 with Howdy Doody and Meathead Sullivan and the old shows and the advertisements of Studio One, and the advertisements were programs in and of themselves, and they portrayed an industrial society that was building things as a way to live, building things as a way to live, consuming products as a way to live. And I watched the two sides of this argument. Do we live by things or do we live by ideas? Going back and forth my whole growing up. And it didn't make sense to me then, and it has taken more than half a century to make sense of why our world has been cut in pieces and the pieces set against each other in order to create a final piece in which unity controls and dominates everything, which seems kind of crazy too. All right. So this is just the introduction. Next, I'm going to play you the clip that I just ran into that articulates what communism was intended to do as I understood it in the 50s. And then we'll continue with the next part.
A book that I think ought to be in every home library. It's entitled Color, Communism, and Common Sense by Manning Johnson. Manning Johnson was a Negro, and he was also a member of the Communist Party. He joined the party as a young man because he honestly believed that the communists were trying to improve the conditions of his people. He was a dedicated communist. But after many years, Manning Johnson finally came to the realization that the communists weren't the least bit interested in improving the conditions of the Negro people. He discovered that instead they were merely planning to use his people, and these are his words, to use them as cannon fodder in a bloody revolution to destroy America. As early as 1928, the communists declared that the racial differences among our people constituted the weakest and most vulnerable point in our social fabric. By constantly probing and straining at this one spot, they calculated that eventually the cloth could be torn apart and that Americans could be divided, weakened, and perhaps even set against each other in open combat. We must not be led into placing the blame for the riots, the civil disorders, on the Negro people of our nation. Even those few who are promoting hatred and violence in the black communities are not themselves the cause. They're merely being used by forces far bigger than they are to promote the violent phase of the revolution in America. Hoping to avoid further violence and bloodshed, the public is to be pressured into accepting measures that will move the country gradually and legally toward communism, but without calling it that. The strategy of the proletarian revolution calls for the quiet conversion of our government into a communist regime, but under the banner of socialism. The new program of the Communist Party on this subject has this to say. The term socialism describes but the first stage of a new society that in its full development is called communism. Socialism is a transitional stage. The building of socialism is the communist revolution in America. It represents the process whereby our country can be moved gradually toward communism without the people even being aware of it. They have one and only one solution for all problems: more government, and then more and more until it's total government. Total government is communism. We must not be fooled into thinking that the causes of our civil turmoil are such things as poverty, poor housing, lack of education, and similar social or economic factors. As a matter of fact, most of today's self-styled revolutionaries, black and white, come from good homes, could earn better than average incomes if they wanted to work. And in fact, they're products of some of the finest institutions of higher learning. We mustn't resort to violence either as a means of furthering political or social goals. And we must do everything humanly possible to discourage others from doing so. We must support our local police. Nothing can be quite so damaging to police morale and efficiency as converting every arrest into a trial of the policeman instead of the criminal. Now, in passing, ladies and gentlemen, you may have wondered why the Communist Party has been a staunch supporter of the drive to place a black studies curriculum into our high schools and colleges. Well, the reason becomes obvious the minute you take a look at the textbooks and the study guides. Under the guise of academic balance, these courses have become a brilliant device for conditioning young people to accept still one more part of the total program for revolution. We must discover the identity of those individuals, both above and below, who consciously are furthering the communist program for revolution, and then remove them from their positions of trust and leadership. Now, of course, the minute you begin to think along these lines, you'll become the target of a whole barrage of attacks. You'll be called a right-wing extremist, a fascist, or at least a dictator. Some years ago, I happened to attend a meeting where several anti-communist refugees from behind the Iron Curtain were called upon to relate their personal experiences. One of the refugees spoke up and he said, "You know, I came to America expecting to find a nation of free men, but instead, I find exactly the same thing. Everywhere I look, I see men and women who know that communists are making headway in this country. They know that something must be done and that someone must stand up to them. But they themselves do nothing. They remain silent because they're afraid that if they speak out or take a stand publicly, it'll be bad for business. They may lose a client. They may even lose their jobs. If communism should ever come to America, we'll face more death, destruction, and human suffering than any people in history has ever faced at the hands of their invading conquerors. It's literally a question of life and death for all of us. And it's about time the American people began to face up to that fact and to act accordingly. Thank you.
See what I'm saying? Back in the 50s, we were very clear and we knew what the Frankfurt School and Marxism and Saul Alinsky and the Fabian group, we knew that the intention was to change everything. So that by the 70s, when I was in my 30s and I was having my third child and my oldest kids were in school, the textbooks in school began to be converted over into the Marxist communitarian view. And when I myself went to university from 1984 to 1993, I was in my 40s going to university, okay. I noticed that at university at that time, process had taken over from outcome as the goal of a society. That in nursing, they only talked about the policies, practices, and procedures. And in communication, they talked about the process of communication, but not the outcomes that communication creates. I noticed then, particularly in the master's program that was conflict analysis and resolution, that our society had become obsessed with methods, particularly technological methods, and we were no longer being cued and mentored and guided and coached into achieving outcomes that worked for all people. The methods that were chosen were specifically to disrupt what we already had. And what we have seen in the past 4 years, since President Trump's miraculous election, has been the renaissance and the resurgence of the simple heartfelt belief that we don't want to be dominated, manipulated, and controlled by processes that have no hope for creating outcomes that we already know are possible. We are seeing a conservative revolution that I never even dreamed of. Yes, I worked for Barry Goldwater in 1964, okay, but he didn't carry the standard to the whole world. And when Reagan was president, we all knew that he was a Hollywood icon who knew how to talk well, but he didn't have the connections to make things happen, to confront all of the tyranny that had taken out JFK and Robert Kennedy and MLK, Martin Luther King. Okay. So I remember the day JFK was murdered. Like it was yesterday. My Heather was a little rugrat, 8 months old, on the floor, and I remember that day because we were all so shocked. But the events, the shocking events that have periodically occurred over and over, we are now finding out, have all been staged by the same crew, the same wealthy, occult, Illuminati educated, effete elites who've been taught to believe that they are very special. You know, specialness is not exactly a blessing. Specialness is a curse on everybody else but you. Specialness. All right. We have to be careful about specialness. We have found out the hard way through the wars in Korea and Vietnam and the Iraq War in the 1990s and Kosovo. I mean, it's just been one after another where this small group of profiteering rich people like Halliburton, DynCorp, and Blackwater, and I don't know what their names are now. You know, there's even Kellogg gets involved in the covert ops. We've been subject to covert operations and secrecy since the 1947 Roswell incident, the institution of NSA, National Security Agency, and the presence of George Herbert Walker Bush in the Eisenhower and subsequent administrations, because he had a lot to do with the Majestic 12 program and how they kept secret not only the fact that there is life on other worlds and that ETs exist and that we signed treaties with ETs that were based on maritime admiralty statute codes and not having no human or rights to life involved in those treaties whatsoever. And this is why the moonshot was filled with all kinds of superstitious and strange things going on. I don't know if you saw the Apollo 11 video, okay? I was a digital imaging tech for Xerox, and I went through the Apollo 11 moon video, and the command module had all kinds of extra people in it, okay? The NASA photographs having kept infrared and ultraviolet out of their photographs, you only have the white light spectrum. Most of the detail in the picture is missing. And so the pictures that NASA gave us never told us what was true about what they were dealing with. And the space agency operates from the belief in discovery. If you discover something, it's yours. And when we know that the moon is a city and it's occupied, well, the people who live there are the ones who own it. And the people who live on Mars are the ones who own it. The people who live on Mercury are the ones who own it. And so the sense of treachery and betrayal has become deeper and deeper and more profound and more profound and more profound until now, since President Trump was elected in 2016. We now have a nation that's woke or awakened to the reality that there was a coup in 1963 that took out Kennedy, and it has been in control of the United States of America ever since, and it has committed false flag event after false flag event after false flag event. I know there was Ruby Ridge, and there was Philadelphia Move, and there was OKC 95, and there was World Trade Center 93, and there was Waco, and these are not in chronological order, but there has been one after another, but they were all staged by the same deep state intel group with the intention to put our constitutional common laws aside and make us subject only to maritime admiralty, laws of the sea, which depreciates the value of a human down to a consumable product. And that's why in the 70s, abortion became legal and it became cheap and free. And so we started killing off somewhere between 40 and 60 million of our citizens. And because we no longer had enough of a birth rate to support the industrial aspect of our country, we had to start immigrating people from other countries who would fill in the gap. I mean, you see, the treachery and double dealing has been horrendous, and now we know this. And so we have already had a patriotic conservative revolution, even to bring down the coup that's intended to halt President Trump's draining the swamp. And the swamp is going to get drained. And our nation is going to be resuscitated and restored to a common law, constitutional government for the people, by the people, for the people, okay? Of the people, all right? And I'm an old woman, all right, but I'm delighted to see this occur, to see the deep state get what it deserves, you know? I think we can rejoice in the thought that we, the people, have confronted evil. We don't know exactly what we're going to do about it yet. There are things in process to bring it to an end, but the coup, the overt coup that began at the end of the Obama administration and has been carried on until now and will be carried on in earnest up until the November 3rd election again. We, the people, are on top of this now, and we're going to make this country good again. I don't know about great, but we're going to make this country good again. And I'm happy about that. And I just wanted to share that with you. We'll see you guys. Bye-bye.